So the first component of this little presentation lecture is going to be a really distilled version of a book by Eric Tribunella that's called Melancholia and Maturation. So basically it looks at kind of our cultural beliefs about adolescence and the idea that there's something that has to come between being a child and being a well-adjusted adult, that's not just a natural process, that something has to be in between there. So at least according to Eric Tribunella, and in his look at how YA literature can help us understand what X necessarily is, he says this book examines a common narrative in 20th century American literature for youth, that of the child protagonist's love for some cherished object, a dear friend, a dog, a possibility, an ideal, the loss of that loved object, and his or her subsequent maturation through the experience of loving and losing it. So essentially for him, X equals trauma. American literature for young adults turns time and again to that which is traumatic as a way of provoking or ensuring the development of children. So essentially what we're seeing in YA literature is a story that's situated around some kind of trauma that marks the passage of the character from childhood into adulthood. We see that in The Outsiders when Ponyboy experiences the loss of his family and friends, family/friends, on his way to becoming adulthood. He also loses some sense of innocence as he begins to understand the essential difference between himself and the socias who have higher socioeconomic status. So now we're going to go ahead and look at a little history lesson about what YA literature was before and after The Outsiders. So really, post-Civil War is when we see what is by some considered the first YA literature, and that's Little Women. I didn't have you read it for this course because it is so long, but that's really the first book that we see that acknowledges some sort of space in between childhood and adulthood and seeks to chronicle that. Looking ahead a little bit, 1930 is when the first Best Books for Young Adults list was launched by the American Library Association, and you'll note that it's not Best Young Adult Books, it's Best Books for Young Adults, because really the YA literature genre didn't exist yet at that time. So really they're listing popular fiction, things like The Indian in the Cupboard, Huckleberry Finn, that are good for young adults to read, but weren't necessarily written with that particular age group in mind. However, by 1936, we do see more books that are being written about that age group. And one of those is Sue Barton's Student Nurse, which was quickly followed by Cherry Ames' Student Nurse. And these were books that kind of followed student nurses through the process of learning how to do an adult job. So that starts looking a little bit at more of the young adult lifestyle. 1942 sees the publication of 17th Summer, which is followed by a different author who wrote Going on 16 in 1946, and that starts to explore dating as part of the young adult experience. And it actually wasn't until 1958, almost 10 years later, that the American Library Association first launched a specifically YA division. So that was all before The Outsiders, but really The Outsiders still marked a major turning point for YA literature. It was the first effort to adopt realism in YA, which has really been the going trend for a very long time. S.E. Hinton was actually a teenager when she wrote that novel, and she claimed to have a better grasp on what real teenage life was like, but you can definitely argue, if you want, that her representation of the greasers in The Outsiders is maybe a little bit contrived. However, her book does include violence, poverty, and other thematic aspects of adolescent life that had been left out of YA literature before then. So after YA literature, there were some after The Outsiders rather, there were some really excellent examples of YA literature that came out, and people started seizing on that realism theme as a new direction for children's lit, YA lit. And one problem though, is the problem novel, which was sort of an effort to capitalize on that. They were quick books that kind of got turned out in the 1970s and 80s that focused more on subject matter than on quality. They've sometimes been compared to like soap operas as they might stand up next to real drama. So the topics might include things like high school dropouts, teenage pregnancy, abortion, divorce, suicide, drug use, politics, running away, premarital sex, these things that adults were maybe trying to influence the viewpoints of young adults about. So they were kind of short dime store novels that were kind of a scared straight sort of a deal. So that was one thing that sort of came out of The Outsiders. Fortunately, YA literature has not necessarily continued down that path, but it is a huge part of the history of YA literature that you should be aware of. Another thing I wanted to look at was just some of the typical qualities of young adult fiction, and many of them are present in The Outsiders. And you can even argue that The Outsiders sort of started the tradition of some of these qualities. We do still see them in YA literature today. In most cases, they're narrated by a young adult. So you're going to be at a first-person perspective, like we hear The Outsiders through Ponyboy's voice. Parents are going to be out of the way, and that's often viewed as sort of a device for letting the young adult characters get the credit for whatever is going on in the book. They're generally typically fast-paced. They only take place over a matter of days or weeks, rather than a long time over years and years, like Little Women was before The Outsiders. That took place over a matter of years, and we kind of see The Outsiders as the start of the change there. They cover a variety of genres and subjects. It's not that they always look at romance or, they always look at illness or anything like that. YA is sort of a large genre that has lots of little subgenres under it. They're becoming increasingly culturally diverse, though it's still a challenge to find really wonderfully diverse YA literature. That is growing, but it's a challenge just because of publication and all kinds of different systematic issues involved in publishing and writers of color having trouble getting their work taken. The books are generally optimistic. They will end on a hopeful note. Very rarely are you going to see a book that ends with just like absolutely terrible, everybody dies and nothing is good. And finally, they tend to deal with emotions that are important to young adults, things like love or learning how to navigate social landscapes, things like that. So if you were interested in The Outsiders and in the time period of writing that we looked at for this week, for your final project, you might be interested in also pursuing The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, 1951. It's on kind of that list of books for young adults that might not have been considered YA literature, but still pointed to by a lot of people as influential. The Pigman, Zindel in 1968 wrote this one, and it's a couple of young adults who form a relationship, not like a creepy one, just like a relationship with an older kind of shut-in man in their community and end up disappointing him. The Contender by Lipsyte, 1967. Robert Cormier's very famous The Chocolate War from 1974, which is actually one of the most frequently banned books. That might be an interesting one to consider. A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich in 1973 looks at heroin addiction. That Was Then, This Is Now is another S.E. Hinton novel that looks at drug use. My Darling, My Hamburger was also written by Zindel in 1969, and that looks at abortion. And finally, Mom, the Wolf Man and Me, Klein, 1972, which looks at an unhappy marriage from the perspective of the child or teenager. So anyway, just to review, we looked at the topics of trauma as a major focal point in YA literature and as part of the passage from childhood to adulthood. We looked at literature before The Outsiders, The Outsiders as a turning point, and literature after The Outsiders, and then we looked at some of the important qualities of YA literature that you can argue were begun by S.E. Hinton and The Outsiders.